Lilach Shafir is the Director of International Education and Jewish Engagement at American Jewish World Service, where she harnesses the political power of rabbis and other Jewish leaders to advance AJWS's mission of promoting human rights in the developing world. Her team is responsible for implementing the Global Justice Fellowship and engaging the leadership of the American Jewish community to join AJWS's human rights campaign. Lilach has spent more than 5 years living overseas, including 3 consecutive years in East Timor as a leadership training and 1 year in Israel as a Dorot Fellow. Lilach has led groups of North Americans on international education programs in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. She holds a master's in international education from Stanford and a bachelor's in international studies in Latin America. Lilach is an advanced speaker of Spanish, Portuguese, Tetun, and Hebrew. And don't worry, the presentation will not be in Tetun, right?
No.
So passing on to you, Lilach. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really good to see you and Diana for holding Olam, and for all of you. It's good to see some old friends, Amy and Tomer and Leora we've met, and I have read all of your bios, and I wish we could be having a cup of coffee, a kos cafe. Kira, I want to, I see you holding a mug, and I want to be sitting in front of you, and I'm still at that point, 6 months, 7 months into quarantine fatigue, that I'm really missing human-to-human interaction. And so I'm seeing the challenges of us being on a screen, but I'm also seeing the opportunities of us to connect, and how beautifully Olam has brought together this webinar series, and that we can be here from India, from the UK, from South Africa, from here in the US where I'm sitting, from Israel. And that's where I'm gonna start this morning. That's kind of my kavanah, or my opening intention, is that we do get to connect from so many different places. And I hope you and your families and your communities are as safe and as healthy as possible during these continued tumultuous times. And we're here to talk about donor relations and do no harm. And it is what I think is a really interesting topic. Thank you, Tomer and Leora, for giving some specifics to what that looks like for you and your work. I'm also not a professional fundraiser, but as I believe everyone at AJWS and American Jewish World Service, we all have on fundraising hats all the time. And for several decades, I've been able to do the programmatic work on the ground that gets to bring in the dollars. And I see that as a real opportunity. So let's dive in to what do no harm can look like from a donor relations perspective, because anyone in any Olam organization is interfacing in some way with donors, either institutionally or on your own. And if you're not thinking about it now, I would offer that you will be thinking about it at some point in time. So let's go ahead and get started in terms of do no harm and what this looks like. Here's what we are going to accomplish today. I'll talk a little bit very briefly about American Jewish World Service, just so you understand my own frame in terms of donor relations. Who am I and why am I here speaking to you about this? I'll share a bit on what donors can bring, how they can strengthen and fortify our work. We'll talk about some different types of donors, and then we will really get into what donor relations and a do no harm frame can look like. And I know these presentations have been finishing off with 5 tips, and so I will leave you with that, with a takeaway, and then look forward to really getting into a conversation. I have my master's in international education, as Yael had shared. Me doing a very frontal presentation is actually a step out of the box because I'm so used to really engaging with different people. So I look forward to both sharing this information, and I will be talking at you for a little bit, so then I have the privilege of talking with you. Who or what is American Jewish World Service? We have existed for 35 years, and we are inspired by the Jewish commitment to realizing human rights around the world. We work in 19 different countries. You can see these in front of you for those on the screen. That's across Asia, East and West Africa, and also in Mesoamerica. We're in 19 different countries, and we focus on 4 issue areas I'll share on the next slide. The most important piece I want to draw out is that we're primarily a grant-making organization. We give grants to more than 450 grassrooted grantee partners on the ground. So it's interesting if you pause for a minute to think about, we're a nonprofit taking in money, we're receiving donor funds. We're also a grant maker giving out grants to hundreds of grassrooted organizations around the world. there's a lot of complexity involved in that, and thinking about do no harm. What does it look like for us as a grant maker to do no harm? And what does it look like for us interfacing with donors, as Tomer and Lyra had discussed, and as we're thinking about today in terms of do no harm? What are the principles and protocols we can agree on as an organization? What is implicit to this? And what does it mean to say that we want to live our values? We're going to dig into this today. AJWS works in 4 different issue areas: sexual health and rights. That's the rights of LGBT people. That's the rights of girls to not be married before they want to. We work in the area of civil and political rights. That's the right of people to organize. That's the right of people to have a voice in repressive governments and authoritarian regimes. We work in an area called land, water, and climate justice. How can people have the right to own and access and have a say about their land? And then threaded through all of this is an area called disaster and humanitarian response. And it both speaks for itself and is an incredibly complex piece of work. We're certainly taking on COVID response, as are many different OLAM organizations right now. So I share this slide to offer how complicated the work is that we do, and acknowledging how complicated the work is of so many OLAM organizations. On one hand, when working with your donors, if you oversimplify, you're just being too reductive and you're losing your donors and you're not giving them the sophistication of this well thought out work. And if you make it too complicated, you're also losing your donors and you're not bringing them along on a journey. Who am I and where do I fit into all of this? As Yael had mentioned, I have 2 decades of working in international education and facilitation. I've led trips and tours and done service work on every continent, and I lived overseas for many years. I want to focus in on East Timor, which was, when I lived there from 2006 to 2009, it was the youngest democracy in the world. And there was this rhetoric for donors around birth of a nation, that this country was just born, which was problematic on many levels because the country always existed. Timorese lived there for centuries and centuries. The country was occupied by the Portuguese government for centuries, and then the Indonesians came in for about 25 years. And then in 1999, when East Timor was declared or voted to be free, all of these international donor governments came in and said, we are here to develop and to further you. And I found that so problematic, and it actually led to me leaving 3 years later. While I spoke both languages of East Timor, Portuguese and Teton, I'm not Timorese, and I should not be telling Timorese colleagues how they should run the Ministry of Education, or how they should return all of these internally displaced people back to their homes from IDP or refugee camps. So I constantly had that lens of how can I, as a person, Lilach Shafir, do no harm, but how can we, as a complicated system in international development and humanitarian response, how can we really do no harm? If you want to focus in on this picture, and I usually don't show pictures of myself, but this exercise is called the problem tree, which many of you might have heard about or have done, which is such an interesting exercise to do with donors. This was after I had led donors for a week in rural Guatemala, and we looked at the data of 60% of Guatemalans living under the poverty line. And you see in the tree, the roots are all of the root causes of that, and the branches being what are the effects. So one example of curriculum that I've used while traveling with donors, and as we talked about before, are you simplifying or are you making things more complicated? Really looking at the complicated nuances of our world of international development, humanitarian response, and for service programs as well. I'm going to share more examples of how we can show and not tell later in this presentation. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with some definitions. What do donors bring to our work? And this is usually a place where I would pause and I would ask all of you to brainstorm with me, but I'm going to share what I have come to see over decades of working with different donors. I shouldn't play favorites with donors, but here at the center is an incredible donor of American Jewish World Service, Judy, who you see her smile and you can just feel her affinity for the work that we do, and that shines through in everything that she does and how she connects to the work of American Jewish World Service when she is on the ground in India seeing our grantees, and this is at a conference in New York. So a few things I have identified that donors bring to our institutions for the long term. They bring recognition. They really can elevate the work that we're doing by giving it a hecture, by giving it a confirmation of how important the work is. They bring trust for the long term. They offer momentum and validation. And I'm going to pause here and say that I really intentionally put dollars as the last one, because we think of donors and we see a dollar sign, but I see so many other pieces and reasons and facets of why donors accompany us on our work. Let's talk about types of donors. And I know that this can vary across institutions. I have two different offerings on the screen, institutional donors, and I don't have room to put all of the logos, and there could be more. This was taken from one conference, and all those different logos of some institutional donors and different organizations. You can pause for a minute and think of who or what are the institutional donors who are funding your own organizations. What are some of their priorities? Some of their preferences, and why do they align with your work? There's also individual donors. On the right side of the screen, you see two supporters of AJWS with one of our Guatemalan counterparts in the field who are deeply interested in our work for the purposes of their own values. I want to offer the other lens of how can donors differ across the different types of work that we do within the OLAM network. Sustainable development work, humanitarian work, global service will bring in different institutional and individual donors. What does that look like for you and for your institution? What individuals or institutions are priority donors that you already have, or those that you're continuing to work with? How is that decided? What is your donor funding model? And there's one other layer that I mentioned earlier when I talked about East Timor, another donor, which some people hold on the same level of institutional donors, and some put in a third category, are governmental donors as well. And I'm not sure the number of institutions who work with governmental donors, but I've seen firsthand how much the Canadian government or the US government, certainly the Israeli government, and other governments or coalitions of governments can have an impact in terms of international development. And how can one work with a government, and so large as that, from a do no harm and donor relations perspective? So what are some things that we want to keep in mind, regardless of the type of donor with whom you are working, if it's an institutional or an individual donor? If they have a deeper relationship with your institution, they can have more impact, and they deserve a deeper relationship. So excuse the metaphor here, you're going to see this photo again. I say relationship, 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 and you see a ship or a boat here, and we're really joining along for that journey. I want you to consider that the greater the stakeholder might be, the greater the impact. I'm going to say that one more time. So the greater the stakeholder, the more funds, the more dollars somebody is bringing to your institution, the greater impact they could have on your work, and the necessity of thinking ahead to that. Coming back to our ship, what is the direction in which you're steering your work? How are you working to steward and to align with your donors? They have to be brought along, just like you're bringing along your team and your colleagues and other people within your institution. There is definitely a direction in which you have to be going with your donors. So what are some of my thoughts here? In terms of the direction of donor relations and do no harm, I offer that you have to plan ahead. Everything in our world can be seen from a proactive or reactive lens. And as we are really taken over by COVID times, of course, we have to react in some instances. But I offer that it is really important that we are proactive as much as we can be in terms of donor relations to mitigate, to minimize the harm that is happening to other communities with whom we are working in international development and humanitarian response and in global service. In other words, if we're mindful of how we're interacting with our donors and how it affects our partners, our stakeholders, our beneficiaries in the developing world, we can do less harm. We aren't forced to make last-minute decisions that can be guided by other factors. I could offer some guardrails in place. These can be really approved by members of different leadership, by the board. The staff can be aware of this, and we have put thought into this in advance instead of just moving forward and making decisions that might be counter to either the mission that we are working towards or the communities with whom we are working. Okay, now I'm going to get really specific and take you through some examples of this in practice, and I'm hoping to show and not tell. And really showing out that communicating with donors is important so they know what they're getting from you. Let's start with measurement and indicators. And Yael and I have had a number of conversations around this. What happens when a donor comes in and unreasonably might have an expectation for what you should accomplish in the world? This is where I offer that being as proactive as possible, especially at the strategic level, and what you're sharing will only set you up for success. At AJWS, we have 3-year strategies, and we track our progress annually of all of our work, of those 4 different areas that you saw in the beginning, of all of my work in international education and Jewish engagement. Our measurement and evaluation is so firmly in place that if a donor comes to us and asks us to track something or create something or succeed in something that is outside of the bounds that we're doing, we then have in place a possibility to discuss that with donors and say how that really goes beyond what we're doing, so that we don't have a donor shifting the work that we're doing. We're able to think back to that ship that I showed, kind of steer the donor along to what we're doing, as opposed to having a donor push our evaluation. I want to talk about how we communicate out expectations and what we give to our donors. At AJWS, we have something called a giving ladder. Other organizations might have a donor ladder. We use the term giving ladder as it's intentionally donor specific. And it offers at each level what a donor can get from us at an institution. I know the writing is small, but you can see at some of the levels. At the top level, our chairs circle, that you can have a private trip with our president and CEO, Robert Bank. So that's spelled out so clearly at that level, so one understands what the offering is at a different level of giving. This obviously has to be altered for virtual times, and the examples will look different for your own organization. But again, I offer how important it is to share with donors exactly what they're getting at different levels of giving. I know some institutions, especially in the international development world, will offer that you can invest in a specific thing. With X dollars, you can fund a building, a school, or a volunteer travel. It doesn't work so much with our human rights approach, but I've also seen that model. And again, I appreciate the transparency. I want to talk about, in terms of being proactive, a gift acceptance policy, as we have put a mask on just about everything these days. Why not put a mask on a $100 bill? Yes, you can smile and take a moment and laugh at this one. But really looking at, as an institution, what are the limits or guardrails on what we can take in? It can be so attractive when someone comes to you and is interested in your work and wants to offer you $1,000, $5,000, $50,000, but it is so counter to the work you're doing, or it might not be so black and white. It might be from a donor that you don't want to work with. It might be for a donor asking you to work in a part of the world that you do not work. So again, looking at that roadmap of being proactive versus reactive, I really appreciate having a gift acceptance policy, which for us is an internal document, and we share out what we're willing to take in, that we will not accept restricted gifts below a certain level. And here's where it gets really important for my work and for the work of other directors doing at the thematic level. A donor can never direct a gift towards a specific grantee, an entity, or an individual. So that's really helpful when I'm leading these international study tours and one of our donors is really getting excited by one of the organizations on the ground. And it protects us from the donor not wanting to give a gift directly to that individual grantee, but bringing it back to American Jewish World Service. And I can think of many other examples where this gift acceptance policy has really supported me in the work that I'm doing. So again, thinking through with your own institution, do you have this in place? Have you thought about it? What does this look like? And how can this support and fortify the work versus having to make an emergency decision? I want to give a few more examples and briefly share ways in which we bring our donors, in the words of Brian Stevenson, to get proximate, to get closer to our work. So this is a huge challenge, I would say, for most Olam organizations. When you live in one city or country, you're headquartered in one place, and your work is happening in another place, in another country across the world. So we're always trying to bridge that gap. I know there are some organizations where it is within the same country and in different parts of the country, but the theme, as I understand, is AJWS is headquartered in New York, and you saw on the map that we're working in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So beyond a webinar and during non-pandemic times, how do we bring people to get closer to the work? And what does that have to do with a do no harm framework? I would say from all of my time at AJWS, that's actually when it comes to the forefront of donors being able to see and interact with the work. And how are we putting those together? And again, what guardrails are we putting in place so that donors can conscientiously and thoughtfully interact with our work on the ground? We have two different ways of taking our leaders, our champions, our clergy, our donors to see our work. On the left, you see our study tours where we travel to a country in which we work, and the end goal is generally fundraising. And on the right, you see the Global Justice Fellowship program that I run. We take rabbis and cantors to see our work so they can come back and be advocates with us in Washington, D.C. And beyond getting on a plane and interacting with our issues in other countries, what does it take to plan for success and seeing the work? I heard Lior mention this in the beginning of when you're traveling with donors, there has to be so much thought put into setting that up for success again, and how we are minimizing the harm that could be done. So one specific way, and we shared this out in advance, is with the AJWS giving policy. This document that is about 3 pages long actually is rooted in our international service programs we stopped running about a decade ago. And I think, Amy, you were involved in one of those many years ago, and others have had touch points. So we looked at individuals traveling to other countries in which we work, in which we make grants. They traveled as volunteers. And we said, again, how do we ensure that volunteers, that donors, that travelers are not doing harm ultimately after they're only going for a week to visit this community? That harm can stay. And those small actions one takes can really stay for decades longer, as we are staying with these communities for so much longer than that. So we continue using this giving policy, even though we're no longer working in international service. We share it with all of our rabbis before we travel. We share it with all of our donors before we travel. It's emailed out, it's discussed on a webinar. And then in that moment when we are in the community and we're doing a field visit, so not sitting in an office in the Capitol, but actually going to interact with the community, we review it a 3rd time. We talk about the importance of not giving gifts or loans to communities visited. We talk about responsible shopping, so not having a busload of US Americans shopping at the same stall or place in a community. We talk about exercising discretion and sharing contact information with people from communities, which is something one might not think about when you take out your smartphone and you Facebook friend somebody, but you have that Facebook connection for decades to continue as that donor goes back to their own community. And it is quite complicated. And we talk about directing any post-trip fundraising back to AJWS. And this is something I have seen so many times. We bring donors to some of the shining stars of our work, to those who can communicate out very clearly, who have incredible stories. We take them to countries in which we are allowed to take travelers. There's many countries we cannot even travel. So people feel implored and compelled to make donations directly back to communities. And it really takes work from our perspective to say, you know, if each donor took out an amount of money and gave it to this community, to this grantee, how much that really could do harm in the long run. What else does it look like in terms of traveling our study tours and doing less harm? We have many different curriculum pieces. I've spoken about them with Yael, and I've done a stock take of other international NGOs, and this is work I deeply appreciate when working with donors and traveling and taking those moments to really talk about what is our impact and what are we doing here. We have a whole session called Ethical Community Engagement. We have another framework around transnational solidarity. But one place that we really bring this to the forefront, and I would implore you as you look back to your own institutional values, just as we have these core values for our own offices and workplaces, dignity, humility, inclusivity, accountability, and courage, what does that look like when I am traveling with a group of donors? What does it look like to be inclusive in communicating? What does it look like to be humble when we get off the bus and we are in rural Dominican Republic or in Guatemala or in Uganda or in India? How does that show up? So this is an actual session we will take our donors through and really brainstorm a group agreement around how we will act, how we will hold one another's accountable. What does the power relationship look like when we are coming from our own cities to communities in which we work? And how can we be thoughtful of that? I know that Yael sent out this piece from Kennedy Odette, and everything Odette writes, I take in and I consume, and I have been doing for the long run. And this is a piece where I want to share that nobody is exempt of thinking of donor relations and doing no harm from a racial justice perspective. And I appreciate how much this amplifies it for the international audience, that the fight for racial justice is not one that is happening only in the US on the streets of Brooklyn, as it has been happening all around me in my own neighborhood. It is certainly one that extends across borders. It is a journey upon which we need to bring our donors, and we need to think about as institutions how the legacy of racial justice, it extends beyond the borders, and any honest reckoning must include open dialogue around race and international development. So if we're working in international development and human rights and humanitarian response, our work crosses borders. The mistake to make is to think that we are immune from these concepts. And I encourage all of you, and it's something we are doing in our own work, at looking how we're bringing our donors along and what does a racial reckoning look like? How does, with our own curriculum materials, how do we include a diverse body of voices? So not just voices from the global South, from the developing world, but also those individuals that we cite and that we take in from Jewish text and from our own Torah and from other places. How are we leaning on localization and looking at the greater value on local expertise, knowledge, and the use of local language, especially when you are bringing donors from another place to local communities, either in person or on a screen, or to bring their dollars. There's many more gems in that article, and I encourage you to read it if you hadn't, but I definitely wanted to bring in Odette's voice into this all. I want to share a few last specifics with my frame of showing and not telling of what do no harm can look like in our work in the global South. In front of you is a grantee partner, CCDA. They are working for agrarian reform, the right to access your land in Guatemala. And you see our leader holding what is or looks like a chamsa, because it is a chamsa, and we bring plaques to all of our organizations to thank them for what they're doing. And the incredible amount of work that they do to prepare for showcasing everything they're doing to our donors. That is no small feat. And yeah, sharing our gratitude and thinking through what honorariums could look like, or what a thank you can look like, or how we can bring our work forward. How do we showcase the work when we're traveling, when we have an hour and a half, 2 hours with a grantee, and how are we not bringing in just our own values as a headquarter organization in New York and the US? And what does that look like if we have some type of idea of what a presentation could be to a group of high-level donors? So here you see Codeco, which is a grantee of ours, a group of midwives, and they have run the show. And what you're seeing, yes, it's a birth skit. And they start off showing how birth typically happens in Guatemala with a group of midwives, and how women are being objectified or killed, or how death might be happening when midwives don't have access to hospitals. And they start with this skit. We then do generally a big plenary session, a large group session, where they can share what they are doing, the work they're doing, and then we get much more interactive so we can have a deeper exchange. Another element to do no harm for me is thinking through, even at the level of dress and how you're showing up and how you're invited into a community. This group, Nuevo Horizonte, is from the north of Guatemala, and they start every meeting with an invocation ceremony to the deities, to the indigenous gods in Guatemala. So you can see them really holding the space. In the front of the picture, you see one of our travelers, our donors, lighting candles, and even observing her dress as we go into the communities, and we will share what our expectations are around how all of us dress and show up, and the space that we take up, and how we can be really deferential to the power and expertise of our grantee partners in the Global South. I want to highlight our president and CEO, Robert Bank, who definitely showcases a do no harm element to me. I just see the humility, one of our core values, with which he is accepting a plaque from this local grantee organization, and the excitement with which he's interacting with another grantee partners. He's certainly been a model in this work for me, as has Ruth Messenger, our global ambassador at AJWS and our former president. I'm going to close this off, but one mantra I want to leave you with is everything I say and do is part of the curriculum. So I'm an educator, as I started off, and I think of that always from the work I'm doing, and especially from a donor relations perspective. Everything I say and do is part of the curriculum. The curriculum is not just a piece of paper. It's not just a lesson plan. It's not just an icebreaker. It's the ways I'm interacting. It's the words that I'm using. It's the way that I am showing up as I am in the developing world with our grantee partners and with donors, and as others are watching me and watching us all of the time. So it is a continued journey, and I intentionally bring in this photo again because we are here to guide our donors to work with them. They can be involved deeply and during your entire institution's whole lifetime, and they can be a lifeline for you, and the need to really work along with your donors. And to think about how you're steering that ship. Where are you traveling? We use the word engagement so much in this field across sectors, across organizations. How are we engaging our donors deeply, thoughtfully, seriously, so we can do less harm with our partners? What languages are we using? What words are we using? How are we showing up as an institution in communities in which we work? How can we be even more transparent? And now I'm closing us off with 5 different approaches for doing no harm. Yael will drop this into the chat at the end of my presentation. And you've hopefully heard me talk about each of these, but really to summarize them quickly, you're defining your tent. You're talking about who you are as an institution and really thinking of the tent as still allowing space to come in. Who are different types of donors that you want to work with? What is your mission? Where in the world that you're working? And then there's the converse of all of those questions. Where are you not working? What are donors that might potentially do harm to the direction, to the type of work, to who you are? Lay the groundwork. I would talk about those as policies and principles for AJWS. It's our gift acceptance policy. It's the giving policy. It's the way we're giving information out to donors, that giving ladder. So 3 explicit ways you saw that we are doing no harm or doing less harm in this work. Words matter. This is something for me that goes beyond donor relations. The words we use, people understand and pick up on. How are you talking about the communities in which you work? How are donors seeing that and understanding that? That's happening in conversations, on webinars. That's happening over email. That's happening on your website. Relationships matter. I know you all know this. The last one that I want to emphasize is ethics as a journey, and that we're all continuing to investigate this, really not just in my webinar, but in the whole do no harm framework. Where are we really succeeding, and where are areas that we can stop and we can course correct and we can adjust? Just as social justice work and racial justice work is a continued journey, this is also a journey, and how we're doing no harm and we're doing less harm given the complexity of that work. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I look forward to talking further.